Hello, welcome to Kant for Everyone on Philosophy for Everyday Life. I'm Jimmy, and I'm excited to continue reading the Critique of Pure Reason in this series. Just going to make sure everything's good here. Great, and if you are watching, hello. So I'd like to move as quickly as I can to reading Kant today, but let me remind you that learning to read a difficult philosopher like Kant is a little bit or a lot like learning a new language. Part of why it can seem difficult is that the words have very specific meanings, and you can only understand those meanings by starting to connect the words to other words and concepts until you have a kind of network of meanings in place. And the larger that network gets, the easier it becomes each time you have to learn a new word, until eventually you have a pretty good sense of the landscape of meaning that a particular philosopher is working with. What I think is especially useful or important about reading someone like Kant is that if you can get the hang of the language of Kant, so to speak, you'll be set up to understand the language of a great many other philosophers as well. For example, I think understanding Kant will make it easier to understand philosophers like Hegel, Kierkegaard, Husserl, and Heidegger. So much of what these later philosophers are up to involves modifying or reworking ideas that we first get in Kant. Even for philosophers like Nietzsche, who dislike Kant, I think that engaging with that disagreement will be more meaningful if you have a clear idea of what is actually being disagreed with. In the opening pages of Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, there is a lovely, witty discussion of how it used to be understood that achieving philosophical doubt was the process of a lifetime. But now, everyone starts with doubt and takes it for granted. Today, we often start with Kant's critics, like Nietzsche or later thinkers, without ever having read or deeply understood the positions that they are rejecting or criticizing. So even if Nietzsche is right in rejecting his predecessors, especially Kant, I think Kierkegaard is right that philosophy is not like the natural sciences, not totally, where earlier ideas can simply be discarded and forgotten because they've been superseded. There's something about going through the process of wrestling toward a position that is necessary in order to understand and affirm that position in a meaningful way. So whether you like what you find in Kant or whether you dislike it, I think that understanding and wrestling with his texts will change how you relate to other ideas and other philosophers, even if those other ideas and philosophers currently seem more attractive or interesting to you. Before we get into the text itself, let me also mention that I'll be holding a series of 6-week philosophy intensives this year. The first intensive begins the week of May 4th and will be called Cultivating an Intellectual Life. So if you'd like to be notified when more information is available, there's an interest form you can fill out. The link is in the description. So let's get started. So we made it up through a good chunk of the preface to the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. And I'll remind you that it was released in 2 editions. The first was in 1781, and the second, I believe, was in 1786, so 5 years later. So we're reading the preface to the first edition, and we'll get into the preface to the second edition. Just get into the middle a little bit more here. Okay. And he's discussing clearness. Before that, he discussed certainty. He had said the form of this philosophical inquiry requires both certainty and clearness. Okay, so what does he mean by clearness? As regards clearness, the reader has a right to demand, in the first place, a discursive or logical clearness through concepts, and secondly, an intuitive or aesthetic clearness through intuitions, that is, through examples and other concrete illustrations. So it has to be logically clear. We also need examples to make it clear to us. And this is a case where Kant uses language in a way that may sound strange to us, but when he speaks of intuition and aesthetics, he's referring to the ability to sort of passively receive information. So the understanding or the reason, these are like active faculties that act upon what they receive from intuition. And generally by intuition, he means sensation, things we receive through the five senses, but he also has a kind of idea of a priori intuition, which we'll get to later. So he says, for the first, this discursive or logical clearness I have sufficiently provided. That was essential to my purpose. But it has also been the incidental cause of my not being in a position to do justice to the second demand, this intuitive or clearness through examples, which if not so pressing is yet still quite reasonable. I have been almost continuously at a loss during the progress of my work, how I should proceed in this matter. Examples and illustrations seemed always to be necessary, and so took their place as required in my first draft. And if you remember from a couple of sessions ago, this work was written over a long period of time, and sounds like there were quite a few manuscripts that he sort of drew on as he was putting together the final version. But I very soon became aware of the magnitude of my task and of the multiplicity of matters with which I should have to deal. And as I perceived that even if treated in dry, purely scholastic fashion, them would by itself be already quite sufficiently large in bulk, I found it inadvisable to enlarge it yet further through examples and illustrations. These are necessary only from a popular point of view, and this work can never be made suitable for popular consumption. Such assistance is not required by genuine students of the science, and though always pleasing, might very well in this case have been self-defeating in its effects. Kant often will give you important terms in italics. So it's nice he's telling us there's a scholastic approach and a popular approach to writing philosophy. Abbot Terrasson has remarked that if the size of a volume be measured not by the number of its pages, but by the time required for mastering it, it can be said of many a book that it would be much shorter if it were not so short. On the other hand, if we have in view the comprehensibility of a whole of speculative knowledge, which, though wide-ranging, has the coherence that follows from unity of principle, we can say with equal justice that many a book would have been much clearer if it had not made such an effort to be clear. So he's saying, if I had provided a lot of examples, it would have been harder for the reader to understand the whole, to get an overview of the principles or the picture that he's trying to develop. For the aids to clearness, though they may be of assistance in regard to details, often interfere with our grasp of the whole. The reader is not allowed to arrive sufficiently quickly at a conspectus of the whole. The bright coloring of the illustrative material intervenes to cover over and conceal the articulation and organization of the system, which, if we are to be able to judge of its unity and solidity, are what chiefly concerns us. The reader, I should judge, will feel it to be no small inducement to yield his willing cooperation when the author is thus endeavoring, according to the plan here proposed, to carry through a large and important work in a complete and lasting manner. Metaphysics, on the view which we are adopting, is the only one of all the sciences which dare promise that through a small but concerted effort, concentrated effort, it will attain, and this in a short time, such completion as will leave no task to our successors, save that of adapting it in a didactic manner, so scholastic, popular, and didactic, according to their own preferences, without their being able to add anything whatsoever to its content. We'll see this in his preface to the second edition as well, but Kant is very concerned with that this idea of bringing metaphysics to a kind of finished state. He genuinely thinks that he has more or less solved all the problems in metaphysics, and that after people read and understand the Critique of Pure Reason, it'll be up to them to teach the principles of metaphysics however they wish, just like we now teach geometry or algebra. But there won't be any more work to do in basic discovery. For it is nothing but the inventory of all our possessions through pure reason, systematically arranged. So he's saying, I took inventory of what we can get through pure reason. Perhaps it's worth just mentioning or dwelling on this word pure for a moment. Get my display set up here. The iPad. There we go. In previous sessions, I've mentioned that there are a series of terms or distinctions that Kant makes. And on the one side, we could say it's empirical matters. And on the other is intelligible. When Kant uses the word pure, as in pure reason, he means pure in the sense that it's not intermingled or mixed with anything empirical. And empirical has to do with experience. We'll see this in the opening pages of the sort of actual text of the book after we get through the preface. But Kant will say all knowledge begins with experience, but it doesn't exactly arise out of experience. There are things in experience that we can actually abstract out of experience and look at as if they're from this realm of sort of pure intelligibility. So when he uses this word pure reason, this is in the background. In this field, nothing can escape us. What reason produces entirely out of itself cannot be concealed, but is brought to light by reason itself. Immediately, a common principle has been discovered. The complete unity of this kind of knowledge and the fact that it is derived solely from pure concepts, entirely uninfluenced by any experience or by special intuition, such as might lead to any determinate experience that would enlarge and increase it, make this unconditioned completeness not only practicable but necessary. Tecum habita et noris quam sit tibi corta suppellex. And I do not know what that means. So if we go back to our list here, basically on this side we have intuition, sensation. Yeah. So abstract from all intuition, he's saying this is what reason gives us all by itself. And the reason I can give you a complete inventory of everything that's here is that we don't need any experience to find out what's there. It's all there in reason itself. So this is not like the natural sciences where we need to conduct experiments and go look around and collect data and so on and so forth. This is all available to reason simply by reason taking a look at itself. Such a system of pure speculative reason I hope myself to produce under the title Metaphysics of Nature. It will be not half as large, yet incomparably richer in content than this present critique, which has as its first task to discover the sources and conditions of the possibility of such criticism, clearing, as it were, and leveling what has hitherto been waste ground. In the present enterprise, I look to my reader for the patience and impartiality of a judge, whereas in the other, I shall look for the benevolent assistance of a fellow worker. For however completely all the principles of the system are presented in this critique, the completeness of the system itself likewise requires that none of the derivative concepts be lacking. So start with this critique, this first critique of pure reason, and then we build out this metaphysics of nature, which I actually don't know that I have a strong sense of what he means by that. So that would be something to look into. These cannot be enumerated by any a priori computation, but must be discovered gradually. So there's an experiential component to this metaphysics of nature. That would be a sequel. Whereas, therefore, in this critique, the entire synthesis of the concepts has been exhausted, there will still remain the further work of making their analysis similarly complete, a task which is rather an amusement than a labor. Worth pausing to mention these terms, and we can add them perhaps below what we just did. Because there are a handful of distinctions that Kant makes, which are just absolutely critical for understanding his work. One is this distinction between empirical and intelligible. Another is the distinction between analysis and synthesis. I'm not going to unpack this one right now because Kant will do it for us shortly, near the beginning of the work. But it's important just to start logging or tracking these basic distinctions that really, once you understand some of these distinctions, you can have a pretty good sense of what Kant is up to. Okay, typographical remarks, we can skip that. Okay, preface to the second edition. This is 5 years after what we just read. Whether the treatment of such knowledge, as lies within the province of reason, does or does not follow the secure path of a science, is easily to be determined from the outcome. We'll stop to mention this word science. In German, this word is Wissenschaft. And Wissenschaft is broader than the English word science, which we might make clearer by calling natural science or the natural sciences. In English, that's generally what we mean by science. In German, Wissenschaft includes the natural sciences, but it also includes the social sciences, the human sciences or the humanities. It includes any academic discipline that wants to claim for itself a kind of rigor and ability to make permanent progress, to generate real knowledge. And what Kant wants to know is whether metaphysics can be a science in that way. Analogous to the natural sciences, but doing its own work in its own way. For if, after elaborate preparations, frequently renewed, it is brought to a stop immediately it nears its goal, if often it is compelled to retrace its steps and strike into some new line of approach, or again, if the various participants are unable to agree in any common plan of procedure, then we may rest assured that it is very far from having entered upon the secure path of a science and is indeed a merely random groping. So he's giving us some indication of what it would look like for something to be a science. It's not random. It doesn't keep stopping short of its goal. It doesn't keep having to restart and retrace its steps. People aren't in disagreement about what the sort of mode of proceeding is. All of these things tell us that we don't yet have a science. In these circumstances, we shall be rendering a service to reason, should we succeed in discovering the path upon which it can securely travel, even if, as a result of so doing, much that is comprised in our original aims, adopted without reflection, may have to be abandoned as fruitless. So he wants to provide a path for pure reason, abstracted from experience, to become a science. That logic has already, from the earliest times, proceeded upon this sure path, is evidenced by the fact that since Aristotle, it has not required to retrace a single step, unless indeed we care to count as improvements the removal of certain needless subtleties or the clearer exposition of its recognized teaching, features which concern the elegance rather than the certainty of the science. And it's interesting, we might want to qualify this today because logic has developed since Aristotle, specifically in the 20th century. It is remarkable also that to the present day, this logic has not been able to advance a single step, and is thus to all appearance a closed and completed body of doctrine. If some of the moderns have thought to enlarge it by introducing psychological chapters on the different faculties of knowledge, imagination, wit, etc., metaphysical chapters on the origin of knowledge, or on the different kinds of certainty, according to difference in the objects, idealism, skepticism, etc., or anthropological chapters on prejudices, their causes and remedies, this could only arise from their ignorance of the peculiar nature of logical science. We do not enlarge, but disfigure sciences if we allow them to trespass upon one another's territory. The sphere of logic is quite precisely delimited. Its sole concern is to give an exhaustive exposition and a strict proof of the formal rules of all thought, whether it be a priori or empirical, whatever be its origin or its object, and whatever hindrances, accidental or natural, it may encounter in our minds. Now, it's interesting to think about Kant's idea of what a Wissenschaft, or a science, is. Logic is an example. Also, physics, I think, in Kant's lifetime, after the work of Isaac Newton, there was a sense that the fundamental principles of physics had been discovered. Yes, there were details to work out, but just like logic, basically we knew the starting principles. Those were certain, fixed, and they weren't going to be improved upon. Now, it's interesting that now I'm not an expert in logic or in physics, but my sense now is in logic there are certain basic paradoxes at the very foundations of logic that remain unresolved. And the same is true in physics. There are certain fundamental principles of physics that still elude human understanding. And it's quite interesting that those two developments occurred, a couple of hundred years after someone like Kant had this sense that logic and physics, like, we're good. We've established what we need to know. So this raises a basic question about human knowledge in general, which is, even when it seems that we've reached a completed state in a certain science, it can turn out that the whole thing gets overthrown. So this seems like something Kant is taking for granted that really we may no longer be able to take for granted in the same way. So why has logic succeeded in this way? That logic should have been thus successful is an advantage which it owes entirely to its limitations, whereby it is justified in abstracting, indeed it is under obligation to do so, from all objects of knowledge and their differences, leaving the understanding nothing to deal with save itself and its form. Understanding is a very important term for Kant. Let's read one more sentence. But for reason to enter on the sure path of science is, of course, much more difficult, since it has to deal not with itself alone, but also with objects. We mentioned this word, Wissenschaft. Let's also talk about these words, understanding. This is Verstehen and reason, which is Vernunft. Kant means different things by these words. Verstehen is a faculty of rules, the application of concepts to particulars, and reason is like a higher level abstraction past understanding. It sort of directs the understanding in a certain way. We'll get to more details on that later, but these are two other important terms that is just important to know that these are different ideas, different concepts in Kant's philosophical vocabulary. Logic, therefore, as a propedeutic, forms, as it were, only the vestibule of the sciences. And when we are concerned with specific modes of knowledge, while logic is indeed presupposed in any critical estimate of them, yet for the actual acquiring of them, we have to look to the sciences properly and objectively so called. Now, if reason is to be a factor in these sciences, what would the science of reason be? That's the question. Something in them must be known a priori. And this knowledge may be related to its object in one or other of two ways, either as merely determining it and its concept, which must be supplied from elsewhere, or as also making it actual. The former is theoretical, the latter practical part of reason. So let's write these terms down. We'll go back to this page because Kant is giving us a couple of additional essential distinctions. A priori goes here in this column of intelligible things that can be known apart from experience. And the opposite of that is a posteriori, things that we know from experience. Another important distinction for Kant is theoretical reason versus practical reason. The critique of pure reason is concerned almost exclusively with theoretical reason, whereas Kant's work in ethics is concerned with practical reason. But we find that Kant starts combining these terms. So, for example, if we take practical reason and we look at it on this intelligible or pure level, this is sort of pure moral philosophy. But if we take practical reason and we look at it on the empirical level, this is what Kant would think of as anthropology, or maybe what we would call applied ethics. I think confusion arises when Kant is doing practical reason on an intelligible or pure level, on an a priori level, and people say, hey, what about application? What about moral psychology, and so on and so forth? But because Kant makes these strict methodological distinctions, that's a failure to understand his method. If you want moral psychology, you can't look in the texts where he's dealing with practical reason on a pure level. You have to go to the text where he's looking at it on an empirical level. If that doesn't make sense, just stick with me. These are just essential sort of fundamental building blocks of what Kant is up to. In both theoretical and practical reason, that part in which reason determines its object completely a priori, namely the pure part, so that takes us back to our list, however much or little this part may contain, must be first and separately dealt with. So Kant is really convinced that in order to do the empirical or applied part of philosophy well, you have to get straight on the pure or a priori part first, and separately. Don't mix them. Because you'll confuse yourself if you do this. Just like you confuse yourself if you try to mix logic with, empirical psychology. He thinks logic is strictly a pure discipline, in case it be confounded with what comes from other sources. That's why. For it is bad management if we blindly pay out what comes in, and are not able, when the income falls into arrears, to distinguish which part of it can justify expenditure and in which line we must make reductions. Mathematics and physics, the two sciences in which reason yields theoretical knowledge, have to determine their objects a priori, the former doing so quite purely, the latter to reckon at least partially with sources of knowledge other than reason. So mathematics is an a priori discipline. We can put that in our list. Whereas physics has a little bit of both. In the earliest times, to which the history of human reason extends, mathematics, among that wonderful people, the Greeks, had already entered upon the sure path of science. But it must not be supposed that it was as easy for mathematics as it was for logic, in which reason has to deal with itself alone. And maybe he means understanding there. This is another thing about Kant, is that he is sloppy in his use of terms, more sloppy than one would have wished. For logic to light upon, or rather to construct for itself, that royal road. On the contrary, I believe that mathematics long remained, especially among the Egyptians, in the groping stage, and that the transformation must have been due to a revolution brought about by the happy thought of a single person, man, the experiment which he devised, marking out the path upon which the science must enter, and by following which secure progress throughout all time and an endless expansion is infallibly secured. So this is Kant's model of a science again. Secure progress throughout all time in endless expansion, infallibly secured. It's a high bar for science, and this is the bar Kant is trying to meet for metaphysics. And he thinks that this happens typically by one person creating a kind of intellectual revolution. Yeah, it would be very interesting to think about Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, with Kant in mind, and ask, there's some similarities with this idea that these revolutions do occur, but I think whereas Kant views them as permanent, like when one of these revolutions happens, it's a permanent kind of intellectual achievement, whereas Kuhn views these more as temporary structures that are sort of perpetually being revised and overthrown as needed, at least on my understanding. The history of this intellectual revolution, far more important than the discovery of the passage round the celebrated Cape of Good Hope and of its fortunate author, has not been preserved. But the fact that Diogenes Laertius, in handing down an account of these matters, names the reputed author of even the least important among the geometrical demonstrations, even of those which for ordinary consciousness stand in need of no such proof, does at least show that the memory of the revolution brought about by the first glimpse of this new path must have seemed to mathematicians of such outstanding importance as to cause it to survive the tide of oblivion. So mathematicians thought it was so extremely important when these initial discoveries were being made that they recorded who made them. A new light flashed upon the mind of the first man, be he Thales or some other, who demonstrated the properties of the isosceles triangle. The true method, so he found, was not to inspect what he discerned, either in the figure or in the bare concept of it, and from this, as it were, to read off his properties, but to bring out what was necessarily implied in the concepts that he had himself formed a priori, and had put into the figure in the construction by which he presented it to himself. If he is to know anything with a priori certainty, he must not ascribe to the figure anything save what necessarily follows from what he has himself set into it in accordance with his concept. Now, Kant is anticipating himself here, because he's saying whoever it was that discovered a squared plus b squared equals c squared, well, I guess we can assume maybe that was Pythagoras, but these properties of a triangle or these geometric rules, you can't get those rules, Kant is saying, by looking really hard at a triangle or by drawing a bunch of triangles and trying to sort of calculate it out for yourself. He's saying we're not reading off the properties of a real-life triangle, but we're bringing out what was necessarily implied in the concepts that we had in our minds a priori. And we put those concepts into the figure and use them to present the figure to ourselves. So we have an idea of a triangle, which has certain necessary mathematical rules. We have that idea a priori. We have it from this intelligible aspect of experience. It comes from pure reason. It's prior to experience, even if we never encounter it except in experience. And we bring these necessary ideas, necessary in the sense that they can't be otherwise, to our experiences of actual triangles in the real world, which generally speaking never perfectly match the necessary ideas that we have a priori. Nonetheless, we use those necessary ideas to present the experience of a triangle to our brains, to our minds, to ourselves. This is how Kant thinks experience works, and he's anticipating the revolution that he thinks he's achieved in describing these early steps in mathematics. Take a drink. I see there are a few of you here. It's great to have you. If you have questions or comments on any of this, I would very much welcome them in the chat. So natural science was very much longer in entering upon the highway of science. It is indeed only about a century and a half since Bacon, by his ingenious proposals, partially initiated this discovery, partially inspired fresh vigor in those who were already on the way to it. In this case also, the discovery can be explained as being the sudden outcome of an intellectual revolution. In my present remarks, I'm referring to natural science only insofar as it is founded on empirical principles. When Galileo caused balls, the weights of which he had himself previously determined, to roll down an inclined plane, when Torricelli made the air carry a weight, which he had calculated beforehand to be equal to that of a definite volume of water, or in more recent times, when Stahl changed metals into oxides and oxides back into metal by withdrawing something and then restoring it, a light broke upon all students of nature, an intellectual revolution. They learned that reason has insight only into that which it produces after a plan of its own, and that it must not allow itself to be kept, as it were, in nature's leading strings, but must itself show the way with principles of judgment based upon fixed laws, constraining nature to give answer to questions of reason's own determining. We have a question. A short summary, sure. Yeah, thanks for jumping in. I'm reading the Critique of Pure Reason, and we're in the preface to the second edition. What we've done so far is to lay out some basic distinctions in Kant's work, and this is a good time perhaps to just summarize some of that again. 3 extremely important distinctions for understanding Kant: the distinction between the empirical and the intelligible. He uses terms like a posteriori for the empirical and a priori for the intelligible. We have analysis and synthesis. We have theoretical reason and practical reason. We're also discussing how Kant wants to know, in this realm of pure intelligibility, abstracted from all experience, is it possible to have a science? And by science, he means a body of knowledge that is established and certain, that can basically serve as a starting point for all future inquiry. He wants to do that for this realm of pure reason, and the science, the name he has for that science is metaphysics. So what he's leading up to right now in this preface to the second edition of his work is what it would mean for metaphysics to be a science. And he's drawing on other examples of what he has in mind. And he thinks of this word science more broadly than we do in English. It's not just the natural sciences, physics, biology, whatever. Logic would be included, mathematics would be included. And now he's talking about natural science. And he thinks in each case, we get to a point where someone, usually an individual, achieves, produces an intellectual revolution, which in a way turns what was, he uses the word groping a lot, a sort of random groping, casting about, looking about. It takes that and turns it into something that has a definite direction and a definite set of principles and a definite set of fixed knowledge. And he's giving examples of how this happened in other sciences in order to set us up for the same thing in metaphysics, which he thinks he is the one who is doing this for metaphysics, what was previously done for logic, for mathematics, and for other natural sciences. And in all cases, he thinks this has to be done by the reason or the understanding bringing something to experience, not merely passively sort of receiving from experience. So he continues here. Reason, holding in one hand its principles, according to which alone concordant appearances can be admitted as equivalent to laws, and in the other hand, the experiment, which it has devised in conformity with these principles, must approach nature in order to be taught by it. It must not, however, do so in the character of a pupil who listens to everything that the teacher chooses to say, but of an appointed judge who compels the witness to answer questions which he has himself formulated. Even physics, therefore, owes the beneficent revolution in its point of view entirely to the happy thought that while reason must seek in nature, not fictitiously ascribe to it, whatever is not being knowable through reason's own resources has to be learnt, if learnt at all, only from nature. It must adopt as its guide, and so seeking that which it has itself put into nature. And you're welcome. Yeah, thanks for the question. That sentence is a bit difficult. But he's saying that the way a science works, in a way, is by identifying what reason itself puts into experience, even with the natural sciences. That sentence is a tough one. I think this will become more clear as we go. I think the example of the isosceles triangle, knowing the necessary, the necessary principles or features, characteristics of a triangle are known prior to experience, in the sense that they're necessary, they couldn't be otherwise, and we use them to construct our experience of the triangle. He's saying something similar about the natural sciences here. It is thus that the study of nature has entered on the secure path of a science, after having for so many centuries been nothing but a process of merely random groping. Okay, finally, metaphysics. Metaphysics is a completely isolated speculative science of reason, which soars far above the teachings of experience, and in which reason is indeed meant to be its own pupil. Metaphysics rests on concepts alone, not like mathematics, on their application to intuition. We'll worry about what he means by mathematics being an application to intuition later. But though it is older than all other sciences, and would survive even if all the rest were swallowed up in the abyss of an all-destroying barbarism, metaphysics has not yet had the good fortune to enter upon the secure path of a science. For in it, reason is perpetually being brought to a stand, even when the laws into which it is seeking to have, as it professes, an a priori insight, are those that are confirmed by our most common experiences. Ever and again we have to retrace our steps, as not leading us in the direction in which we desire to go. So far, too, are the students of metaphysics from exhibiting any kind of unanimity in their contentions, that metaphysics has rather to be regarded as a battleground, quite peculiarly suited for those who desire to exercise themselves in mock combats, and in which no participant has ever yet succeeded in gaining even so much as an inch of territory, not at least in such manner as to secure him in its permanent possession. This shows beyond all questioning that the procedure of metaphysics has hitherto been a merely random groping, and what is worst of all, a groping among mere concepts. So metaphysics has just been a staging ground for pretend intellectual fights, but as a science, it's basically been random casting about. It hasn't been on a sort of secure path. What then is the reason why, in this field, the sure road to science has not hitherto been found? Is it perhaps impossible of discovery? Why, in that case, should nature have visited our reason with the restless endeavor whereby it is ever searching for such a path, as if this were one of its most important concerns? So, if you remember the first paragraph of the preface to the first edition, he says that reason is kind of in this bind where it can't help asking metaphysical questions about things like immortality or God or freedom. And at the same time, reason is incapable of answering these questions. Nay more, how little cause have we to place trust in our reason, if in one of the most important domains of which we would fain have knowledge, it does not merely fail us, but lures us on by deceitful promises, and in the end betrays us. So he's concerned, can we even trust reason if it deceives us and misleads us in these questions that we feel compelled to ask, these metaphysical questions? Can we trust it in other areas? Or if it be only that we have thus far failed in the true path, are there any indications to justify the hope that by renewed efforts we may have better fortune than has fallen to our predecessors? It's interesting that he thinks metaphysics is in such a sort of bad place, that he thinks it's not a secure science. Because I think if you were to ask Aristotle this question, or Thomas Aquinas this question, I think they would say, no, we've got a science of metaphysics. It's in good shape. And I think that perception held true until maybe the 15th, 16th centuries. And then at some point, that consensus broke down. So we find someone like Descartes trying to rebuild from the ground up in a way very similar to what Kant is doing. What are the basic philosophical starting points that are just absolutely certain? And of course, he landed on his famous "I think, therefore I am." I have a live stream on that as well if you're interested. Let's continue. The examples of mathematics and natural science, which by a single and sudden revolution have become what they now are, seem to me... Oh, did it got a glitch? It could be a... Yeah. Let me just make this a little bigger so I can read it. A bug or glitch in our reasoning faculty. Our capacity for reason is usually really useful for survival when applied to the real world, but breaks down when applied to reason itself. Yeah, that's not so far from what Kant is going to say. But I think the worry he raises there is, because reason finds itself compelled to keep asking these questions, we may think that it's useful for survival in the real world, but can we trust it in that case as well? If it's not reliable, and these other questions that reason keeps sort of prompting us to ask. He'll have more to say about this question, but I think you're on the right track. Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so the examples of mathematics and natural science seem to me sufficiently remarkable to suggest our considering what may have been the essential features in the changed point of view by which they have so greatly benefited. In other words, how did these earlier revolutions work? Their success should incline us, at least by way of experiment, to imitate their procedure, so far as the analogy, which as species of rational knowledge they bear to metaphysics, may permit. Now here he's going to tell us what his intellectual revolution is. Hitherto it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects. This is worth writing down. So, objects lead to knowledge. But all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori, means of concepts, have on this assumption ended in failure. We must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success in the task of metaphysics if we suppose that objects must conform to our knowledge. start with knowledge and we build objects. This is where it starts to become important to understand Kant's terminology. I'm not going to try to define these terms precisely right now, but if this feels crazy, that's partly because it is a very counterintuitive way of thinking about human knowledge, and also because the way Kant uses these terms may also be somewhat unfamiliar. So I think the implication of that is withhold judgment about agreement or disagreement until these terms take on a little more contours, some more specific contours. So this would agree better with what is desired, namely that it should be possible to have knowledge of objects a priori, determining something in regard to them prior to their being given. When he speaks of something being given, he's referring to intuition, which is a passive faculty for receiving impressions, sense impressions, but also there's a kind of a priori intuition that applies to things like geometry. We should then be proceeding precisely on the lines of Copernicus's primary hypothesis. Failing of satisfactory progress in explaining the movements of the heavenly bodies, on the supposition that they all revolved around the spectator, he tried whether he might not have better success if he made the spectator to revolve and the stars to remain at rest. So Copernicus was working with a model where we had the Earth at the center and the sun revolving around it. And the math just didn't work. So he switched it. He said, what if the sun is at the center and the Earth revolves around the sun? And that revolution set sort of physics on a sure path. Kant is saying something similar. Objects or experience have been thought to be at the center, with the perceiving subject. This is the subject rotating around it. And Kant is saying, what if we put the subject, the one who does the experiencing, at the center, and objects rotate around? This is called the subjective turn or the transcendental turn. Turn to the subject. A similar experiment can be tried in metaphysics as regards the intuition of objects. If intuition must conform to the constitution of the objects, intuition is our sort of perception, I do not see how we could know anything of the latter a priori, because everything would be coming at us a posteriori. But if the object, as object of the senses, must conform to the constitution of our faculty of intuition, I have no difficulty in conceiving such a possibility. So objects of experience conform to the way that we experience the world. That sounds like subjectivism. And if you have watched an earlier live stream where I look at a few commentators, Theodor Adorno is very eager to remind us that Kant is not a subjectivist, in the sense that he doesn't think everyone has a sort of a different experience, and it's different for everyone. He thinks objects of experience conform to our faculty of understanding, but that the thing they're conforming to is strictly necessary. It's the same for everyone, and it couldn't possibly be different. Why he thinks that will become clear later. Since I cannot rest in these intuitions if they are to become known, but must relate them as representations to something as their object, and determine this latter through them, either I must assume that the concepts by means of which I obtain this determination conform to the object, or else I must assume, or else I assume that the objects, or what is the same thing that the experience in which alone is given objects that can be known, conform to the concepts. Again, the triangle example is, I think, the most obvious illustration of this. Because he thinks that you can't get the necessary properties of a triangle passively through experience. Those necessary properties are something that we bring to experience. And I think this is the simplest way to think about the sense in which Kant is saying objects conform to necessary concepts that we bring to experience, we don't get out of experience. We usually think of the brain as reading off the world, but it's primarily guessing and updating those guesses, if I understand modern neuroscience correctly. Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I think there's a lot, and a previous one, this reminds me of how the brain primarily tries to guess what's out there in the world based on its already learned patterns, and then updates its guess based on incoming sense data. Yeah. So Kant would, everything you're describing there, to go back to this this page, and thank you very much for these comments. I think these are extremely helpful to get clear on what's going on here. Kant, everything about the brain updating its patterns, Kant would put in this realm of empirical. So there's a kind of analogy here to what he's to the way he thinks that reason or understanding work. But if those concepts are revisable through experience, Kant would say that goes in the sort of a posteriori bucket, or the bucket of experience. What he's looking for is aspects of experience that are absolutely strictly necessary, just as necessary as the law of non-contradiction or 2 + 2 = 4, things that cannot possibly be revised and that are what makes experience itself possible. So he's taking this even a level deeper than this question of the brain receiving sense data from the world and then revising its concepts accordingly. In Kant's mind, that would be an empirical, experiential process of learning, but it wouldn't fall in this realm of pure philosophy. Okay, let's go a little bit further. In the former case, I am again in the same perplexity. Read this last comment. So those necessary things he's looking for, can I think of that as built into the brain, even before it starts learning from incoming sense data, those a priori things? Yeah, built into the brain, but I think also Kant's going to want us to stop thinking in terms of the brain. Because he wants, well, for one, you might have a human brain that is damaged in some way and has lost these concepts. But he wants us to think in terms of structures of experience that are prior to any kind of empirical or physical embodiment of those structures. That's kind of the best I can give you at the moment. So he thinks in the latter case, the one he's trying to describe, the outlook is more hopeful. For experience is itself a species of knowledge, which involves understanding. And understanding has rules, which I must presuppose as being in me prior to objects being given to me. So we never experience these prior a priori things solely through reason. Uh-oh. Looks like I disconnected. Okay, I'm back. I'm not sure what was missed, but Okay, I'm right here. As regards objects which are thought solely through reason, and indeed as necessary, but which can never, at least not in the manner in which reason thinks them, be given in experience, the attempts at thinking them, for they must admit of being thought, will furnish an excellent touchstone of what we are adopting as our new method of thought, namely that we can know a priori of things only what we ourselves put into them. We'll read this footnote and then I'll stop. I think I'll stop there. This method, modeled on that of the student of nature, so he's saying I am taking the natural sciences as a model, consists in looking for the elements of pure reason in what admits of confirmation or refutation by experiment. Now, the propositions of pure reason, especially if they venture out beyond all limits of possible experience, cannot be brought to the test through any experiment with their objects as a natural science. So we have a problem, which is that in natural science we can seek confirmation of these principles, whereas in pure reason, because we've abstracted from experience, that method doesn't quite work. In dealing with those concepts and principles which we adopt a priori, all that we can do is to contrive that they be used for viewing objects from two different points of view. On the one hand, in connection with experience, as objects of the senses and of the understanding, and on the other hand, for the isolated reason that strives to transcend all limits of experience, as objects which are thought merely. If, when things are viewed from this twofold standpoint, we find that there is agreement with the principle of pure reason, but that when we regard them only from a single point of view, reason is involved in unavoidable self-conflict, the experiment decides in favor of the correctness of this distinction. So what does he mean? So a word about his method here, unavoidable self-conflict. Kant thinks that if a position, if an idea leads you into self-conflict, into self-contradiction, you can infer that the opposite position is true. And what he's telling us is that when we view objects from two different points of view, on the one hand, assuming that we bring these a priori principles to the objects in order to understand them, and on the other hand, assuming we don't, which view generates contradictions? And that will tell us that the other view is correct. I think that's what he's saying in this footnote, more or less. And we have one more comment. The fact that Kant wants to think of reason beyond the brain, is that why it's idealism, as opposed to physicalism? Or did they just not think of the brain in this way back when he was writing? Yeah, I mean, definitely understanding of the brain was not as advanced, but I think you're right. Kant is definitely not a physicalist. And yeah, he's thinking of reason beyond the brain. I mean, Kant's saying we have experience, that's undeniable. That's sort of a given. That's a thing that just confronts us that we have experience. How is it possible that we have experience? And what happens when we work backward from there? And yeah, he kind of lands on this idea that there are certain things that are unavoidably necessarily true. Certain structures of experience that that we bring to all experience. So yeah, I think this is a good starting point for thinking about why this is idealism. And yeah, he's definitely, we might also use the word empiricism. Like he thinks experience is extremely important, but he doesn't think experience is capable of interpreting itself, which means that there must be something else we're bringing to it. And hopefully the answer to that question will become clearer as we go. Thank you for these questions. These were fantastic, excellent questions. I really appreciate it. I'm going to stop here in terms of the reading. For those of you who are here, thanks. It's wonderful to have you here. I really welcome the questions, and I truly hope this can become an ongoing dialogue. I'm going to be holding a philosophy intensive starting in May, the week of May 4th. It's called Cultivating an Intellectual Life. So if you'd like to work alongside others, text together to have discussions on a regular basis, that will run for 6 weeks. You can register your interest on the form in the description. And hopefully I'll have more details on that coming out soon. So thanks again to those of you who are here, and I'll see you next time.